sandwiched between two famous kings, his father John and his son Edward. He is the forgotten ruler of the 13th century. His reign was long and not beaten until George III. So, follow me as we explore the tumultuous reign of Henry III. Let's get stuck in. In the November of 1243, Henry III was in Wallingford Castle, Oxfordshire, where his brother Richard of Cornwall and his new wife Sanchia were celebrating their wedding feast, a lavish event, as any other you'd expect from the mid-13th century. And after the loss of the Cent War to the French, the English could certainly do with some cheering up. Right now, in Wallingford, Henry was making sure his brother's new wife was feeling right at home, which she would be, given the amount of her people that were now in their country. The Seavoyard Faction, brought over by his sister, Queen Eleanor of Provence. And this faction was growing and growing. For each step forward Henry took, in the eyes of his critics, he'd take 2 steps back for each time he favoured these controversial foreigners. And, unlike before, the Queen's mother, Beatrice of Savoy, had also entered the political arena. And 2 of her daughters are married to the royal brothers, Henry and Richard. In fact, all 4 of her daughters will end up being married to kings. Margret, she's already married to Louis, King of France. Eleanor, she's married to Henry, King of England. Beatrice, she's married to Charles, the King of Napoli. But Sanchia, I hear you say, she's not married to a king, she's married to Richard of Cornwall. And we both know that Henry lives a long time, so there's no way old Dickie's getting the throne. Oh, don't worry, nothing bad happens to him either. But one day, Richard of Cornwall will become a king in his own right in another land. But that is a story for another day. Meanwhile, Simon de Montfort can also see that Beatrice, the Queen Mother, has a lot of influence at court. So he plans to use it to his advantage. He seeks her help in a bid to use her influence on mending his standing with the king. After all, he was once the favourite. They were once good friends. And Beatrice of Savoy does in fact sway the king round to see the logic, most likely working through her daughter, Eleanor. Given the political tensions arising, Simon de Montfort is pretty much the embodiment of chivalry and would be a valuable ally going forward. It's taken a few years, but finally the 2 friends are back in each other's good books. One man knew exactly what it was like to get on the wrong side of the king, and this was the Earl of Kent, Hubert de Burgh, the fallen justiciar. We've not heard of him in a while. He'd been stripped of his position and arrested in the past, his ambitions often marring his reputation. De Burgh had been around for years. He grew up in the days of Henry II. He's seen the course of Richard Coeur de Lion, and he's even served under the infamous King John. He's the one who made him a justiciar of the country. When the French Dauphin invaded England during the Barons' War, it was Hubert de Burgh who defended Dover Castle against multiple sieges from Louis the Lion. He was the regent to Henry III while the lad was still in his minority. It was he who, in an attempt to save the future of the crown, sacrificed the French campaign, pretty much. Everything Hubert did was for the crown, but was seen by many as furthering his own ambitious goals. In his prime, he had achieved lofty heights. But in the 1240s, he was an old man in his 70s, a retired knight who'd long hung up his lance and shield. He'd long given up his ambitions, having learned his lessons many years ago. In the March of 1243, the old man passed away in a Surrey bandstead. He was King Henry's last link to the old regime. Hubert de Burgh's body was taken to Blackfriars in London, where the magnate was entombed. Finally finding peace after all these years. On January the 1st, 1244, also in London, there was another grand spectacle. Because King Henry had given the order that the poor people in London were to be fed. And fed alms they were. A grand multitude turned up, recorded at around 6,000 people. This was New Year, a holy day, the day of the circumcision of Christ. So, at Westminster Palace, the old palace, not the new one, a multitude dined in the painted chamber, while the children were fed in the Queen's chamber. This was a grand affair. For all his faults, Henry was a deeply religious man, and giving alms to the poor was a fundamental part of Christianity. And this event was no one-off affair. On average, Henry was feeding around 500 of the poor a day. Around 240,000 meals had been prepared throughout the previous year. When the king's sister Isabel passed away a few years ago, he'd feed 100,001 paupers. That's the one that counts. And each year after that, he'd make sure that 4,000 hungry bellies a year would be fed on the anniversary of her death. Usually Henry himself would be at these events, helping the poor and giving food. But this particular time, he was still in Wallingford in Oxford, having spent not just the wedding, but the Christmas there. The wedding festivities pretty much blending into the season celebration. But it didn't take away from the fact that 6,000 paupers were fed. Even his rival, the French King Louis, was impressed by this charitable work, and given that Louis would one day be made a saint, this was high praise. He'd even forbid his own magnates from mocking Henry about the recent English invasion. Yet, even Henry's piety had its limits. He was a meddling king. When last year, in 1243, on Christmas Eve, he barred William Riley from entering Winchester Cathedral, despite him being elected as the new bishop there. This ended up in another squabble between the king and church. One step forward, two steps back. William Riley had even put Winchester on a religious interdict. Basically, excommunication for the city. The church did try to get the Archbishop of Canterbury, a Boniface of Savoy, to get the king to see reason. as these actions were against the Pope and Magna Carta, which he'd sworn to. However, they were up against the Seavoyard Faction as well, and Boniface was the Queen's uncle, he's one of the King's favourites. Right. Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln, had even tried to get Boniface to lean on Eleanor to sway the King, but everything's falling on deaf ears. Thankfully, the papal interregnum was over, and a new pope was elected in the summer of 1243, Innocent IV. Unlike Gregory before him, he wasn't a good friend of the king and wasn't going to side with him on the issue of Winchester, and so a letter is sent from the Pope to King Henry, telling him to obey. William Riley is the Bishop of Winchester, if he liked it or not. And Henry was not a man to argue with the highest authority in the church, so he yields. The interdict on Winchester ended, and in April 1244, Riley resumed office. As usual, when one argument looks to be over, another one begins. Ralph Neville, the Bishop of Chichester, he passes away in February, and the king tries to meddle in that bishopric also. He was incorrigible in his meddling. For a king so religiously minded, it's quite the irony that he spends so much of his reign battling with the church. And there is some lengthy correspondence between the king and Bishop Grosseteste, with Grosseteste reminding the king about that fine line between church and state, and about Magna Carta. Like usual, neither men are backing down, stubborn as always. Oh, and about Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln, aka Robert of Lincoln. One day he'll be venerated as a saint, and is quite the scholar. He's one of the leading minds at the time in what we would call scientific method. He's a leading mind in optics and mathematics and physics. He believes that mathematics is the most important science of all. His ideas were not what you'd expect from the mid-13th century, as he's already breaking grounds in the concepts of light and colour. He understands that it's particles of light. He understands about the cosmos, but not in a medieval manner, but a modern one. The fact that the world is a sphere was common knowledge back in the 13th century, but what was groundbreaking was this. Grosseteste develops the concept that the universe was born out of an explosion of colours, and that light dragged and expanded the particles in what is remarkably similar to the idea of the Big Bang. As these particles expand and become more dense. And what's more, he believes that the cosmos is bound by a set of physical laws that cannot be broken. He's rewriting Aristotle. And he's the man who taught the famous Roger Bacon, the man that invented pork. I'm joking. Roger Bacon was another leading mind in optics, physics, and Grosseteste had taught him all he knew. And there were no persecutions, no bigotry. These radical scientific ideas were embraced, and he's not the only one doing it. And as I said, he was venerated as a saint, though not fully canonised. That failed to be achieved. And his feast day is on the 9th of October. There you go. Keeping with the church, a papal messenger does appear early in 1244. Not a legate, not a nuncio, but a humble clerk named Martin. I say humble, but he was far from it. This lowly clerk had been granted extraordinary powers, including that of excommunication. And Martin begins by trolling the prelates and making sure they do not give less than 30 marks each to the papacy. That's quite a substantial amount of money. It didn't go down very well. On top of this, Martin proposes an assignment of money to the Pope's 9-year-old nephew. Talk about nepotism. And this clerk is really not popular with the clergy. Now, get this. The clergy are asking Henry to step in. The irony! But Henry is more than willing to oblige, and sends a letter of concern to Innocent IV. We'll get into that in a bit, but first we have a situation going on with the Welsh. A tragedy of sorts occurred on March the 1st, on 1244. Right, a few years back there was that tension in Wales where Llewellyn the Great passed away, and 2 of his sons vied for the vacant throne. Dafydd was the rightful heir, but Griffith wanted it, and a crisis emerged. In the end, Dafydd ended up indeed becoming the Prince of Wales, King of Gwynedd. Then, with the intervention of King Henry, the rascal Griffith was in England, more or less, because he's currently imprisoned in the Tower of London. He's been there for the last 3 years. But Henry has only ended this family squabble for the interests of England. So should Prince Dafydd rebel in any way, Henry could release the brother, and Wales would once again fall to infighting. This is not the first time that Griffith has been used as a pawn in his way. As a child, King John once used him as a hostage against his father, Llewellyn the Great. But the Magna Carta of 1215 had forced his release. At the Tower, this was also no house arrest. He was very much confined to the quarters of the Tower itself. He's imprisoned. But Griffith is about to make a daring escape, one that makes the history books. From his room, he fashions a rope from linen sheets, and proceeds to descend to his freedom. The bugger is that the makeshift rope snaps, and the hapless Griffith falls to his death, killed instantly. Now Henry has no leverage against the Welsh prince. So, just in case Dafydd reconsiders raising rebellion against the English, Henry thwarts him by befriending Griffith's eldest son, Owen Goch, meaning Owen the Red. He is sent to neutral ground in Chester to parley with his uncle, the Prince of Wales. Owen has taken his father's cause and threatens his uncle that should you rebel against the English, you'll have a fight on your hands. And Dafydd could not afford more Welsh infighting. But Dafydd also wasn't silly. He'd assumed that the king would pull something like this. He sends a letter to the Pope asking for protection against the English, which is granted. There was also Griffith's younger son, Llewellyn. He was loyal to his royal uncle, i.e. Dafydd, and very much against the King of England. Not only that, like his father and grandfather, he was very competent in the political arena and the battlefield. Llewellyn is no stranger to King Henry, for even though he's only in his early 20s, as a teenager, he went on that crusade with Richard of Cornwall a few years back. I will also add that Prince Dafydd, the King of Gwynedd, is married to the daughter of the infamous William de Braose, the butcher of Abergavenny, and possible murderer of Arthur of Brittany. She's Isabella, Princess of Wales, and is also related to the legendary knight William Marshal. But unfortunately, the marriage is barren, and Dafydd, at 32 years of age, desperately needed to secure his lineage. He needed a son more than ever. Should anything happen to him, the crown of Gwynedd would go to either of his brother's two sons, Owen or Howell, both who opposed one another, meaning conflict would be inevitable. So with the tension in Wales growing and looking like things might erupt at any moment, Henry decides to let the martial laws deal with it, making sure it doesn't spill out into England, and pretty much ignores the problem. Up in Scotland, King Alexander had remarried several years ago, and this time to a French lady named Marie de Cossey. Between the two of them, they also have a son, also called Alexander. One day, he'll be Alexander III. Now, given that King Henry has been planning for years to marry into the Scottish royal family, this doesn't bode too well. Originally, he had succeeded, as his sister Joan had married the Scottish king. But the king and the queen grew estranged, and upon returning back to England, the poor woman had died of unknown causes in her brother's arms. They had no children. Her and the Scottish king, not her and her brother. Heaven's sake. But the birth of his new son, Alexander, to a French woman, this enraged King Henry, who accuses the Scottish king of colluding with the French. And once again, tensions between the Scots and the English are kicking off. Henry even plans to mobilise an army in Newcastle on the 1st of August, in preparation to invade Scotland. So quite a bit is brewing up. In mid-June, while waiting for the muster in Newcastle, Henry commissioned a new battle standard, one fit for a royal. And he spared no expense. A gold dragon on a red background, complete with sapphires as eyes. It even had a tongue designed to flap in the wind. And this was meant to intimidate the Scots. It didn't, and Alexander marched his armies 7 miles south of Newcastle. But not for war, but for parley. Thus, days of negotiations began, which included the king's brother Richard of Cornwall and the Archbishop of York, Walter Grey. Thankfully, on the 13th of August, a treaty was agreed between the two kingdoms, when it was assured that Scotland had no intention to quarrel with England. The French marriage had no bearing on their relationship. Part of this truce was the marriage between Alexander of Scotland's young son, also called Alexander, and Henry's daughter Margret. Oh boy! Margaret's only around 5, and her future husband, this Alexander, is only about 4. This is a long shot. The arranged marriage was planned for early next year, around 1245. With peace achieved in Scotland, instead of heading for Wales to deal with the situation there, Henry's army disbands and he retires south. Possibly so he could save on costs, as troops aren't cheap and he's not getting the scutage. All he can afford are 2 groups of household knights to assist the martial lords who defended the border, as the situation in Wales is deteriorating. The northern forces are all but wiped out by a Welsh ambush. Their commander, Herbert Fitzmatthew, is slain with them. King Henry has no choice but to face the situation in Wales. Once again, he calls Parliament at the refectory at Westminster, and he summons the magnates and prelates, as once again he needs finances to prepare for conflict. He's proposing a new tax. Henry addresses Parliament in person for the first time, an historic occasion. After all, he's head of the state. It is decided that a committee of 12 would be created to deliberate on the matter, and deliberate they did. Henry is reminded once again of the Magna Carta, that fine line between state and church, the treaty between the magnates and the king. He's pretty much told that to get the money, he'd have to go through further reform, stricter reforms, because currently the charter appears to mean nothing to Henry, as he's constantly breaking it. The king also still ruled with neither a justiciar nor councillor. The barons and clerks also wanted a say in how any tax money generated was spent. They were looking for not just another charter, but a written constitution bound in law, requiring a new type of councillor trained in both law and finance. Not magnates, not bishops, but commoners who understood bureaucracy. Henry likes these common councillors, as it means he doesn't have to deal with the barons all the time. He liked yes men, who'd rather pore over fine rolls and charters, picking apart the law with a fine tooth comb, rather than some baron who'd spends his free time hunting in the forest or scrapping in a tournament circuit. These were lowly clerks and knights, none from traditional aristocratic ancestry. Yeah, sure, these wouldn't be commoners as we'd imagine today, the sort of working class, blue-collar workers. They are still pretty well off and are already on the ladder, so to speak. But things are changing, and Parliament's evolving. It's taken a while, and it will take many years yet, but things have to start somewhere. It's all looking very familiar, isn't it? Lords, commoners, all politicking in the halls of Westminster. Like I say, it's got a long way to go, and it's a far cry from the politics of our modern Parliament. But like I often say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Plus, the Westminster Palace that Henry would be using wouldn't be the one used today, which was built during the Victorian era. But even back in 1244, you have the beginnings of a recognisable parliament. As for the barons, well, they now needed the positions of justiciar and chancellor more than ever to rein in this new army of bureaucrats. They knew full well that Henry has employed a personal army of yes-men that will allow him to get away with bending the rules, especially when the king expands these bureaucrats by 4 new members, just making sure they're all English as not to irritate the barons further. But there's quite a lot going on this year, and I'll try my best to sum up the gist. And we've not quite dealt with the situation with Martin the Clerk. So let's roll back a few months. Let's go back to around the spring, before the Scottish truce and around the time of the Welsh crisis. Right. Remember that letter Henry sent to the Pope about Martin? The king had been leaning on the clergy in hope they'll support him in kind, because the arguments against his meddling were still ongoing. Plus, he really needed the military aid for the trouble with the Scots and the Welsh, etc. Around this time, Henry himself is already in the process of lobbying the bishops, speaking to them each in turn, one by one, explaining that when it came down to politics, everybody was on the same page. The king even gets Simon de Montfort and Peter of Savoy to put a good word in, trying to sway them. We're all in it together. If I am poor, says the king, then you are poor. He also has leverage, as the Pope has responded to his letter, and the Pope supports the king. He's asking the clergy to act. However, William Riley has yet to play his wild card, because he still has not forgiven the king for barring him from Winchester the previous year. He is rallying all the bishops behind him, bogging down the talks in a blatant act of filibuster, which lasted for months. As for Martin, the clerk, people suspected that he'll be asking for more money later down the line, and they were right. Martin the clerk is in fact asking for even more money, 100,000 marks, this time producing papal documents that hadn't appeared before that gave him extra clout. The papacy were clearly planning something big, and people suspected that the money was needed to raise funds for yet another war against Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Henry also had other deep concerns, for, a bit like in Scotland, he's trying to get a foothold in Sicily. For his sister Isabella had married Frederick, upon the Pope's request. She became Isabella of Sicily. Yes, she may have passed away, but money-grubbing Henry has clung to the idea of having a foot in the door in Sicily. Plans that wouldn't mean a jot if the Pope gets his way. And what Martin feared was that Henry was receiving letters from the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, fears that were realised when Henry ordered them to be read out in public. And here, Frederick's words revealed all. He was begging Henry not to fund the new Pope's war against him, this braggart, this materialist. The Emperor accused Pope Innocent of raiding villages, towns, taking lands that were not his. All Frederick wanted was peace. Or so he claimed. In reality, the imperial forces were marching on Rome. All this did not go down well with Martin the clerk, and he's getting the message that he's not getting the money. By now, 2 councils had provided nothing for the war against the Holy Roman Emperor. Martin explained to the king that he's leaving and required safe passage, and Henry grants him safe passage. May the devil grant you safe passage to hell and beyond. Harsh words, especially for the 13th century, and Martin went complaining to the Pope. Only by now, the Pope was in flight. As with the imperial forces on his doorstep, Pope Innocent IV was left with no other option but to abandon the Vatican, abandon Rome. He fled to France. And that is where Martin met him. Because by now, in the November of 1244, Pope Innocent was in Lyon. And with horror, Henry realised his grave error.